FELIX FINKBEINER has been an activist for over 13 years now. Since the age of 9 years old, he has dedicated his life to the reforestation of our planet and to help with the urgent climate crisis.
It is now time that we work together. We combine our forces. Old and young, rich and poor, and together we can plant 1 trillion trees. We can start a 1 trillion tree campaign.
When I was 11 and first began activism, I saw the film Revolution featuring him and was immediately inspired by his work. Since then, he has tirelessly worked for 13 years, and Plant for the Planet has become a global organization with the goal of planting 1 trillion trees. I had the honor of sitting down with Felix to talk a little bit more about his work.
Everybody that is going to start 1 million trees in their country, come up on the stage.
Youth activism, and a new documentary recently released featuring him. It's such an honor to have you here with me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Rachel.
I was curious if you could tell us a little bit more about the work you do and why you started.
So it all started 13 years ago. Back then I was 9 years old in my 4th grade class, and I was supposed to give a little presentation about the climate crisis. And when I prepared that presentation, I found out about a woman from Kenya called Wangari Maathai, who had planted 30 million trees in 30 years. And that inspired me that we kids should be planting trees as well. And I suggested to my classmates that we should plant 1 million trees in each country of the world. And lots of them liked the idea, and this is why a few weeks later we planted our first tree. And we were incredibly lucky then because 2 local journalists reported about that tree, and this is how some other local schools heard about it and started planting some trees as well. And then we had a slightly older student who created a very simple website for us, which was essentially just a ranking among local schools of who had planted the most trees. And lots of schools wanted to outcompete one another. And this is how Plant for the Planet grew at the beginning. After 1 year, we had planted about 50,000 trees. All of this was in southern Bavaria, by the way. And after 3 years, the first million. And then children and youth all around the world started slowly joining us, and Plant for the Planet spread internationally. And today, Plant for the Planet is a global children and youth movement, kids planting trees all across the world. But that's not all we do. Another important part of our work is our large-scale reforestation efforts we do here on the Yucatan Peninsula in southern Mexico. That's where I am right now. This part of Mexico used to be lush rainforest, but unfortunately, a lot of this rainforest has been destroyed in recent decades. And this is why we took charge of restoring 20,000 hectares of degraded forest. That's an area about the size of the District of Columbia, DC. And we now have a staff of about 100 employees here that plant on average 1 tree every 15 seconds in the area around where I am right now. And I'm currently in our shade house. This is where we run experiments on different tree species to see which compositions of tree species are ideal for our restoration work.
It's incredible that you've followed through with your activism. A lot of people stop after a certain amount of time, and this has become your life's work. And I guess I'm curious to know, how do you believe being involved in activism from such a young age has shaped your perspective of the world?
That's hard to say. Obviously, I've been doing this since I was 9 years old. There's no way for me to compare or understand what my life would have been like, or would be like right now, if this hadn't happened. But like, I think it's really important to understand it from the outside. It sometimes seems like I've been doing the same thing for 13 years. And I think when you do the same thing for 13 years, you lose interest, you lose passion. But of course, our work at Plant for the Planet has evolved in incredible ways since then, right? From a group of children activists to now a more professional reforestation organization, and a lot of other things we've obviously done over those years. And this evolution has, kept my interest and made sure that it was always interesting, always fun to work here.
That's amazing. And because you have been involved in activism for so long, you've probably seen a lot of shifts, first of all, in the way that activism is done and shifts in the world. Our world has changed even so much in the past year. Do you feel like the state of our planet is better or worse than when you began?
In terms of climate change metrics, the world's clearly become worse since I started 13 years ago. We've emitted a huge amount of CO2 in those 13 years. Actually, almost every year we've emitted more CO2 than in the year before. And we're still very far away from reducing our emissions to zero, right? Because we're actually still increasing our emissions. So in that sense, the world has gotten worse. At the same time, there are also some positive developments. We've made massive progress on the technology front in regards to the technology we need to address climate change. Solar power, for instance, has gotten cheaper at a much, much faster rate than anyone would have expected. And the same is true for a lot of other technologies. So even though we've made very little progress on solving the climate crisis so far, it's now much easier than we thought it would be to actually do so.
And that's why you also took up tree planting, because trees sequester carbon and can be a huge part of the climate crisis. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and why you believe trees are so important and are such a huge part of the solution?
Yeah, we always thought that trees were ignored far too long as one of the most powerful solutions to tackle the climate crisis. When we first started, we also didn't really understand how truly powerful trees are. Of course, we knew about photosynthesis. Trees capture carbon from the atmosphere, but no one knew how big of an impact trees could have, and that's why even we thought of tree planting more as a symbolic gesture. And on our Plant for the Planet t-shirts, it always says trees for climate justice. So we thought of trees more as a symbol. But we supported quite a bit of research over the years, and a lot of other research also came out that estimated the global potential impact of reforestation potential. And we now know that it's very hard to, if not impossible, to maintain global temperature rise below 1.5, below 2 degrees without massive global reforestation. In fact, we have currently around 3 trillion trees on Earth and reforestation potential to plant up to another 1 trillion trees. So on top of the 3 trillion, we can plant 1 trillion, or rather restore 1 trillion more trees. And that can have a massive impact, not just in capturing carbon, but also in protecting biodiversity and also creating a lot of jobs for countries of the global south.
Absolutely. And there's this new age of corporate control over our planet, of destruction of our earth. And I'm wondering, with corporations often trying to capitalize off of these green movements, one pressing issue, for instance, is new genetically engineered trees that are patented and owned by corporations, posing a threat to biodiversity, but then they're being marketed as a solution to climate change. And how do you feel about greenwashing techniques like this that frame issues as a solution when in reality it's damaging the environment?
I don't think there's any real involvement of genetically engineered trees in the reforestation movement, just simply because we have such a beautiful diversity of excellent tree species that there's just no need for that really here. On top of that, I think then the right involvement of companies is a really interesting question. On the one hand, we all want to be, purists and do it all by themselves and distance ourselves from the ones that have contributed to causing this crisis. At the same time, restoring 1 trillion trees means that we have to plant trees on about 10% of the world's surface area. That's a huge task that requires a lot of funding. And some of that support can clearly come from governments, but mobilizing governmental funding at that scale is incredibly difficult. So there are also good reasons to try and get companies involved in making that possible. But very clearly, when we speak to companies, when we try to advise companies, they're very clear that their first priority must always be reducing their own emissions. But then a second thing they absolutely should contribute is also in restoring ecosystems.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a place for companies who are trying to better themselves, and that's happening all over the world because they see the need to be involved and to be active and to try and protect our generation. And it's about time. And part of that, I wonder, as an activist for so many years now, what have been the biggest challenges that you've faced as a person? What are the obstacles that you've had to overcome?
I mean, in building an organization with now 130, 140 employees globally, there were an incredible amount of like difficult and challenging moments over those years. One that immediately comes to mind was quite early in our history, actually. This must have been 2011, I think. So back then, I was invited to give a talk at this conference where the CEOs of all the big chocolate companies were gonna, listen to me giving a talk. So we thought that was an excellent opportunity. So we spent months preparing that speech, and essentially the idea was very simple. We wanted each one of these companies to donate €1 per ton of chocolate they produce. And with that €1, we'd be able to plant one tree. And we called that the future fee. So we prepared it for months. And the idea was that I would give my talk, and afterwards the CEO of the company organizing this big convention would then go on stage, ask all his peers, all the other CEOs to participate in this. So I gave this talk, and then the CEO came on stage, but instead of proposing this idea we had developed over months, he just thanked me and then left. So I decided to grab the microphone myself, went back on stage and told people they should be giving us this money. But then not a single company agreed to participate. And this was obviously a huge disappointment for us. I cried that evening after that conference. But then one of our young ambassadors, Max, suggested, then let's make our own chocolate. And even though was a crazy idea, we went ahead with it, and we developed what became the Change chocolate, which is of course carbon neutral and fair trade. And most importantly, all the profits from the chocolate will go directly into tree planting. And this is how with every 5 bars of chocolate we sell, we can plant a tree here in Mexico.
That's so beautiful. And it's adaptability at the end of the day. I think that comes with a lot of activism. And we've all had to be adaptable to and trying to attract new people into movements and trying to spread our activism. I'm curious to know why you think that some people maybe aren't feeling as urgent or the need to feel or take action within the climate crisis. Why do you believe that maybe some people aren't feeling that urgency as much?
Fundamentally, it's very difficult to explain to people the urgency of the climate crisis. This is a crisis that has been slowly developing for 200 years now. And obviously with every year, it's exponentially getting worse. But it's very hard to tell people that after it took 200 years to reach 1 degree, a threshold where, of course, we're seeing some consequences, but the vast majority of the world's population is not feeling any consequences, then now it's only going to take a few years for us to pass the 1.5 and later the 2 degree threshold, and then stuff is suddenly becoming very bad. This is a very counterintuitive development, and it's very hard for people to understand. So a lot of the climate movement is sort of creating this artificial urgency, or trying to make this urgency, make these cutoff points vivid to people. But yeah, fundamentally, it's incredibly difficult. And the true difficulty of all of it is just the scale of change necessary. Any problem that requires 194 countries to solve it is just really difficult to solve.
Absolutely. So this may seem like kind of a silly question, but I'm curious, If you had control over the world for a day, what would you do? What would the world look like? What changes would you make?
That is a very difficult question.
Mhm.
I feel like but in the climate movement, we have a lot of easy first step policy solutions that we could immediately pass, right? We start phasing out all subsidies for fossil fuels, and we put a tax on carbon essentially. Carbon tax might not be the only good solution, but it's certainly one good solution that can work at scale. So we introduce a global carbon tax system where people have to pay a little money for every ton of carbon they emit, and then we spend that money on other mitigation strategies. And I think that's probably the best thing one can do in a day.
I wonder too, what gives you hope for the future? Because with this magnitude of issues happening, and with everything that you've seen within the climate movement, within reforestation, within the state of our global world at the moment, it can be very easy to get overwhelmed. So I'm curious what pushes you forward and what inspires you to keep moving with your activism.
I was really inspired this past year by Greta Thunberg and the Fridays for Future movement. Even though I've been involved in trying to mobilize young people in climate activism for 13 years, I would have never believed that it's possible to create such a mass movement of young people and to have play such an influential role in the politics of many countries. In the U.S., obviously, the movement didn't have a big impact for obvious reasons because the news cycle there is dominated by other factors. But in many European countries, including Germany, including Austria, and the Netherlands, for instance, this movement had a huge impact in shaping public opinion and to a small extent even in shaping government policy. There's a Green Party coalition. The Green Party is a government in Austria, basically only because of this youth movement. So that was truly inspiring, and it gives me hope that we'll be able to continue mobilizing people in those magnitudes.
Absolutely. So with that in mind, what's next for you? What are the projects that you're working on? You mentioned that you are in the Yucatan right now. So what other projects are happening? What's going on in terms of your work?
Our mission for many years was to convince the world we need to restore 1 trillion trees. But after some big high-profile studies came out about this, and this was discussed, this was taken up by the WWF, by the World Economic Forum, by the huge US corporation Salesforce, and even the White House announced their nominal support for this project. We're no longer in the situation where our main mission is to spread the word about this, but rather to focus on the implementation. And to do this, we're mainly doing two things. One is our work here on the Yucatan Peninsula. Our goal is to restore 100 million trees here until 2030. So that's the one big thing we're focusing on. And the second part is we want to make it as easy as possible for all the other reforestation projects all around the world to scale up their work and grow their work. And to do this, we developed the Plant for the Planet app. It essentially brings transparency to tree planting projects. If you want to support a tree planting project, you can use this app to discover excellent projects all around the world. And for each project, see where exactly they're planting, what survival rate they have, what species they're planting, and so on, the cost per tree. And then you can use the app to find your favorite project and then directly support that project. Donate to them. Also gift trees to your for friends for Christmas and much more. And what's important here is that 100% of the donations go directly to these tree planting projects. We at Plant for the Planet, we don't keep any of the money. 100% goes directly to this project. We just want to make it as easy as possible for people to find excellent projects and then support them.
That's amazing. And with that in mind, recently a documentary is coming out. It is out now, and people will be able to find that at impactseries.net.
Share a common goal. We want a future. Is that too much to ask for?
What do we want? When do we want it? What do we want?
You've been in many documentaries. What is it like to have your work basically memorialized in a documentary or in a film?
I've never thought about it that way, actually. You just mentioned at the beginning this documentary. What was it called? Revolutions.
Mm-hmm.
And it was mainly about great climate activists around the world. And I just had like this, small moment there of when I was at a protest. I think this was at the COP climate conference in Cancun in 2010. And there was this big protest of youth activists there, and they were then taken away by the conference security. And I was right there in the middle of it, crying, because this was my first experience in such a protest, and it seemed so momentous that the security forces were taking it away. In fact, they were actually just later dropped off at a McDonald's, just a few hundred meters away from the conference venue. So it was all a bit less dramatic than it seemed for me at the time. But I then saw that documentary a few years later, and it made me cry seeing my former self there, so anguished. So I don't know. Never thought about it as memorializing me as much as just how it gives you this opportunity to see like a past self.
Absolutely, and see what your work is like in that moment and how things have changed and adapted, because up until this point, I had only seen you in that film, and obviously following your work, but it is interesting watching that evolution. And you have done so much over your past 13 years in activism. And this is a big question because we are both young, but what do you hope your legacy will be? What do you hope to leave for the generations that are yet to come?
I think that the climate crisis is by far the biggest challenge of our time. And I'm certainly going to spend the next decades, or I hope I will, in helping to address this climate crisis. I think mainly by helping restore the world's forests, but maybe also in some of those other strategies. But it's very hard for me, very hard to me to say what the next decades will be.
And that's all part of the journey. I want to thank you so much for the interview today and for talking to me. This has been such an honor. And I want to say, if you want to find out more about Felix, be sure to watch Now documentary, which is already out. You can find it on impactseries.net. And once again, thank you for all your work. You are leaving such an incredible world and inspiring so many young people to become active and to understand their impact and what they can do to make this world a better place.
Well, thank you so much. It was lovely meeting you.